Ouch! Ouch! Okay, that's irritating me. Stop that. Seriously, I had no idea it was going to be like this. Is it worth the suffering? Hello, I'm Camry Sharp. Welcome to my podcast, Youth Like You. Our topic today is A Pearl with a Cost, and it is on how suffering can change us into something of greater value. Do you know how a pearl is formed? It's simple, but it's not easy. The oyster produces the pearl, but it is not an overnight process. And in the first place, not all oysters produce pearls. This is how it happens. When an oyster is not happy or satisfied to stay where it is, especially if it wants more food, it begins to move. Now, this is very important. You know why? Because while the oyster is moving, a tiny grain of sand somehow gets into the oyster's shell. Then something fascinating happens. The oyster begins to suffer. Hold it. Didn't you just say something fascinating happens? May I inform you, Camry, that suffering is not fascinating? Let me continue with my story. It's through this suffering that a pearl is produced, because the oyster begins to coat this small grain of sand that is causing irritation. The oyster adds a layer upon layer of the stuff it produces until the grain of sand becomes a pearl. Here we see why I said it was fascinating. If the oyster had not suffered a little, it would not have produced the pearl. Also, if the oyster had been content with its situation and did not want to go on looking for more food in better places, that grain of sand would never have gotten into its shell. Hence, no pearl. Sure, I bet the oyster didn't like the suffering, but it was for a time, a stage in his life. And what came out of the stage of suffering was a pearl of great value. Likewise, we can produce spiritual pearls. Just like the oyster sought for something else and wanted something more, we too should be seeking more of the Lord. Hebrews 6:1 says that we have to advance in Christ, not rejecting what we have learned already, the elementary doctrines, but by using it as a foundation to build upon. We have to grow in Christ. Just like a mother wants her child to come to maturity and become an adult, so the Lord wants us not to stay as spiritual babies, but come into maturity. And that is how we come to perfection in Christ, through growth, through maturity. But what happens when we begin to move on in God? What happens when we decide, you know what? I want more of the Lord. I'm tired of where I'm at. I need to grow more. I need more nourishment. I desire more of the Lord. Well, just as the oyster got a grain of sand stuck in its shell, we're going to have grains of sand spiritually get stuck in our shells as a result of moving on in the Lord. If we stay in the same spot spiritually and do not move, no grains of sand can get in, but neither can the pearl. The enemy does not attack sleeping, standstill Christians because a sleeping, standstill Christian is not a threat to him. The enemy attacks Christians that are on the move, Christians that are marching on in God, Christians that are seeking the Lord and hungry for Him. And then the enemy tries to throw a grain of sand in our way, hoping that we will be stopped in our tracks. These grains of sand come in different forms. It may be that we're suffering from our health, maybe a person, possibly a couple other things. One thing I know, what we're all going through, what we're all suffering from, is the coronavirus. Maybe you're thinking, how in the world are these things going to help me grow spiritually, let alone bring forth a pearl? This is what will determine the pearl, our attitude. When we are faced with suffering, whatever it may be, what is our reaction? What is our attitude? An ugly attitude that complains, murmurs, criticizes, rejects, and blames everything on God will not get the sand grain covered. Instead, we'll feel the irritation even more. Romans 8:17 says that in our walk with Christ, we are going to suffer. Sorry, but we're going to. But it's so that we can be glorified with Him, with Christ. And Romans 8:18 says, I consider our present sufferings insignificant compared to the glory that will soon be revealed to us. Let me read that again. I consider our present sufferings insignificant compared to the glory that will soon be revealed to us. A good attitude allows God to work in our lives and cover that grain of sand so that it begins to form a pearl of great value. A good attitude is one that says, not my will, God, but yours. A good attitude is one that says, I don't understand, but I know that when this suffering is over, I will have a pearl of great value. Suffering is not for eternity. Neither is this COVID-19. Suffering is not something we want to see happen in our lives, but it is something that each of us will face sooner or later. The truth? Whether we reap irritation or pearls depends on us, on our attitude. The time we are going through right now with this coronavirus or with any other form of suffering, it can be a fruitful time, a time of spiritual growth, a time where we come out with many pearls. Let's give God the open door to work that irritation into a pearl. Let's stop focusing on our suffering and instead focus on what can come out of the suffering. Hebrews 12, I believe it's verse 1 or verse 2, says that for the joy set before him, Christ endured the cross. He wasn't looking at the cross the whole time. He knew it was there, but he saw what would come forth, and that is what he set his eyes on. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says that there is a season for everything and a time for everything. Suffering is temporary, a season, but pearls, they are eternal. You've been listening to Camry Sharp on Youth Like You. Thanks for listening. See you soon.